right, thanking God again for letting us get this far, this time in 1 Corinthians chapter 2. Let's call it, in building off of that theme of consider your calling, let's talk about the way Paul considers his approach to the Corinthians as I de-emphasized the real source of the conflict that he really kind of spells out in chapter 1, them thinking that either Paul was better than Apollos, might have been better than Cephas, and then one group thinking they might have had the best argument, I follow Christ, he's better than all. Well, that's true, but the motive can still make the right answer the wrong way. And so it was something about that answer that I follow Christ that wasn't doing any more to alleviate the friction that was growing in those different factions. And so he is going to pause that discussion, pick it back up in chapter 3, as he is going to help them understand why he took a more measured approach in speaking with them, because it has everything to do with not feeding the conflict, whether he could know how bad it was going to get, not feeding the potential conflict that eventually arose in Corinth. And with that, I think the conversation, or at least the chapter for me, I best understand it through the lens of two choices, one in the first 5 verses or so, and then another in the last few verses, we'll say 14 through 16, the end of the chapter. That first decision, that first choice, is going to be a decision that Paul is literally going to say in verse 2, for I decided to know nothing amongst you except Jesus Christ and him crucified, going back to the simple approach he referred to in chapter 1. But he is going to say that it is not wisdom that is the enemy, because there is a type of wisdom in the next section. He's going to say that he does rely on, in verse 6, yet among the mature, we do impart wisdom, although it is not a wisdom of this age. He's going to go on to describe the way that that wisdom is communicated or revealed, though, in verses 10 through 13, when he's going to say it's revealed through the Spirit, literally in verse 10, as he is going to say, however, there is an impediment. God is not going to force divine wisdom upon us, even through the Spirit. He's going to say that it can be impeded by our choices. Once again, going to that whole concept of decisions. It's going to say in verses 14 through 16, 14 in particular, that the natural person does not accept the things of the Spirit of God. You still have the choice to reject even the most plainly stated truths and what we typically call denial. And he's going to seem to say, in our modern terms, denial is a great way to miss the things that the Spirit is trying to show everyone. But going back through those verses, there's some themes, because if you get bogged down, or I'll say, at least if I get bogged down in the words, there's some meanings that I think I lose track of because there's so much going on in chapter 2. But thematically, there are a few examples that I think help me understand a little bit more of what's going on in this chapter. When going back to that whole concept of Paul deciding to take a more measured or simple approach, he's going to say in verse 3, he was with them in weakness, in fear, and in much trembling. And his speech and message were not in plausible words of wisdom, but in demonstrations of power. Going back to that whole concept of our talents are one thing, but the question is, what are we really doing with them? And so Paul dumbed down the approach that he could have taken with the church at Corinth, so that the simplicity of what he did could really emphasize the power of what God was capable of doing. The Holy Spirit doesn't need us to use a whole lot of words for God to step in and emphasize the truth of very simple statements that we can make. And so when Paul, the same Paul who was impressive to the greatest or the highest levels of Roman rulers that he spoke before, he didn't use that same eloquence that kept them coming back to hear him again and again with the church at Corinth. Why? Because he might have realized that they were inclined to use human wisdom in toxic ways. And so instead of feeding their tendency to use their wisdom against one another, he toned down his own wisdom to set an example for what they should do with regard to their disputes or their disagreements with one another. It's going to be the same thing that he talked about in the church at Rome. He may have certain freedoms with regard to foods sacrificed to idols, but you tone down your freedom for the sake of building your relationship with your brother. He's going to talk about that with the church at Corinth, with the church here at Corinth as well, but he's giving us an example of why he took a more simple approach with Corinth, understanding that the audience that we find is so huge. And Paul is going to help us understand later on, he became all things to all people. He might have said that already, but either way, I'll try to quote it. He became all things to all people because he understood his audience was different depending upon where he was. And here at Corinth, he toned it down to make sure that he did not basically give candy to kids who were already hyped up. And the last thing they needed was a sugar rush. And so that's an example of what we would say now. If you're looking after kids, you don't have to know very much about kids to know if you give them sugar at the wrong time, you're begging for problems. And so for the church at Corinth, giving them clever phrasings or words of human wisdom, that was giving candy to kids who didn't need it. And so instead, he used simplicity so that the Spirit could quite possibly, it's not going to literally say this, even though verse 5 is going to pretty much make it seem like this is what's happening, but he's going to keep his word simple so that the Spirit can then endorse the truth of what he's saying with the kinds of power and miracles we know that the apostles were capable of doing, the kinds of things that couldn't be manufactured by human ingenuity or cleverness or whatever. And that's going to be important to remember for another reason, as verses 6 through 9 remind me of an illustration we use from time to time. That is the illustration of shelf life. So in addition to there being limits to human wisdom, there's a shelf life on it that the wisdom of God doesn't have. The wisdom of God proves to be eternal even after human wisdom has spoiled, for lack of a better term. Understanding that shelf life is something we use to illustrate the difference between the shelf life of milk that doesn't last very long, or things like maybe canned goods. I don't know, find a better illustration. But they're just things that age or mature better than others. It reminds me of a skit or a bit that a Christian comedian had back when I was a youth minister, taking kids to different events. And he had this bit talking about, that doesn't travel well. And so he would ask different kids their names and talk about whether or not their name would travel well. Because there are some names that, no matter what region of the country you go to or where you go, that name travels well, meaning it doesn't seem odd depending upon your circumstance. And so likewise, there are certain levels of wisdom that travel well. And so he is talking about here, helping them understand the way that human wisdom does not travel well in all places. Matter of fact, whatever they consider to be clever in Corinth might not travel all that well to Rome. And so likewise, he's helping them to understand that just as Corinthian wisdom might not do so well around Roman rulers, Corinthian wisdom might not do very well around God. And so he's trying to get them ready for the one that they are going to have to meet, the one who matters more than the environment that they're currently in Corinth. And why does that matter? Well, it reminded me of another story. That's the story of Steph Curry. I talk about him from time to time, but I haven't talked about him in a minute, so I'm going to indulge a story because his dad, when Steph was relatively young, progressing well for a young kid, small for his age, he had developed a shot that was appropriate for his size. But his dad, having played in the NBA, realized that even though those shots were falling in middle school or wherever he was at the time, they were not going to travel well to the next level or where he was hoping to go, because he already knew his son had NBA ambitions. And so they tell the story of the summer where Steph had to remake his jumper, and it was an emotionally painful process that made him almost want to quit. But his dad was right. And after remaking his jumper into something that was repeatable and sustainable and something that could take him to the NBA, it not only took him to the NBA, it has basically had him now classified as the best shooter ever. And so likewise, Paul is talking to the church at Corinth, helping them to understand that as emotionally attached as they might have become to the conventional wisdom of their environment, he is helping them to understand that as painful as it might be, much like Del Curry spent a summer with Steph, retooling his way of shooting a basketball even more, they need to get in touch with the way that God is trying to get them to reevaluate the wisdom they become fond of versus the wisdom that actually has a shelf life, the wisdom that will travel well, not only in Corinth, but to make them the kind of people that, as we say from time to time, God will want to be around forever. But as we mentioned, the choice is there. And so just as in the first few verses, Paul made the choice, or he decided not to flex the same kind of impressive wisdom he did amongst the Roman rulers, the wisdom that made him a hit with pretty much all of them. He sacrificed his wisdom to understand the best approach in Corinth. And likewise, Paul is going to describe the way that the Spirit of God helps us to discern all things, meaning there are things that are outside of our experience that God has already mastered and he's willing to show us. But those things don't necessarily fit well through a narrow perspective. And so much like the proverbial square peg in a round hole, just like it says in verse 14, the natural person does not accept the things of the Spirit of God. It's going to be tough for us to accept all the things that God can help us to understand if we're always trying to force fit God's perspective into our own. And so the question for the Corinthians is the same as Paul's question, I guess, to us. Are we going to give up enough of our perspective for the Spirit of God to guide us into becoming the kind of people that not only God wants to be around forever, but, as we often say, the kind of people that all his people want to be around forever? Something that Paul's going to talk more about in chapter 3.